Welcome to our Scholar Activist Conversation. I'm Rose Brewer. I will be one of the commentators, facilitators of this evening. So we're really happy to have you here, especially given the defining moment that we're in. It's a period of obvious turmoil as well as possibility, resistance, and the need for us to really struggle in the most profound and deep way. So we're hopeful that this conversation will be a lead-in to the work that we all need to do. I'm going to turn it over to the co-facilitator, Ben, and he's going to do a little bit deeper framing for the moment and then introduce our panelists for this evening. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Rose Brewer. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I want to thank community organizations that have stepped forward to sponsor this event. The American Sociological Association and the Society for the Study of Social Problems are gathered here in Seattle this weekend and this week. And it's for that reason that a number of us who are both scholars and activists felt that it was essential that if a gathering of these two organizations was to happen in Seattle, Washington, with the topic of rethinking social movements, that there be a conversation that happened that was more dynamic and maybe a little bit less disinterested than some of the conversations that we're trained to have in academia most of the time. So that is the purpose of this discussion, is to have a conversation about the moment in which we find ourselves, to look back not only to the historic moment of Seattle 1999, where probably most of the people in this room were in the streets at that time, those of us who are local and those of us who are not, but also to have a conversation about how scholars and activists, whether we're located in the community or on college campuses, or both, can support social movement action through research, and how those who are primarily engaged in activism and our intellectualism comes out of our praxis, can inform the research of social movement scholars. So that's the gist of the discussion tonight. I'm going to very, very briefly introduce our panelists today, and I'm going to do that just so that that is recorded for those who are watching on video. I really want to thank Mike McCormick for shooting this, so that people around the country have actually said this looks like a very interesting conversation. They can tune in. But if you're interested in the full biographies, of course, you can look online at Facebook, or also at the Liberty Tree Foundation's website. There is a listing of who is here tonight in terms of the panelists. So I'm going to start off with Rose Brewer behind me. She is a scholar activist. She is a professor of sociology. She is the Morse Alumni Distinguished Teaching Professor of African American and African Studies at the University of Minnesota in Twin Cities, so my sister state is a Wisconsinite. And she has been extensively involved in social change efforts over the years. For myself, her work with the U.S. Social Forum process and the World Social Forum has been one of the most salient roles. To my right here is David Cobb, and we'll do applause at the end if you feel like it. David Cobb is a self-described people's lawyer. He's dedicated to making the promise of a democratic republic a reality. He practiced law for a number of years, but basically decided that we needed a people's law, and he has been involved in many things, co-founding Move to Amend. He was the Green Party's presidential nominee in 2004. He was the best man at my wedding and a lifelong comrade. Sitting to his right is Heather Day. She co-founded Seattle's Community Alliance for Global Justice with others who helped to organize the 1999 WTO protests. And she was co-chair of the board for many years before becoming the director in 2007. So I feel like there's some generational representation here for, you're a Gen Xer, right?
I don't know. I don't think so.
You don't know? We're folding into the millennials, but I feel some kinship here. All right.
I don't know a Gen X.
We'll talk about that. We do have a couple people who are listed as speakers who were unable to make it, both for serious family commitments. So just sending our love to Greg Maney and to Rosalinda Guillen, who are not able to make it here today. So I just wanted to let you know if you're waiting for them, you will wait a little bit too long here tonight. Sitting behind me is Charlotte Ryan, or Char. She's a professor at UMass Lowell. She's a former labor and community organizer. She is, in my mind, one of the leading advocates in this country for movement-relevant research. I've been learning a great deal from Char about the practice of movement-relevant research, and I think you're going to enjoy meeting her tonight if you don't already know her. To my left is Cindy Domingo, and let's see, here we go. I know many of you know her. She began her political career as a member of the US-based Union of Democratic Filipinos in the early 1970s. She has been involved in many essential struggles, both locally and internationally, over the years. She is currently the chair of LELO, which is the Legacy of Equality, Leadership, and Organizing, a 43-year-old organization whose mission is to empower workers, especially workers of color and women. And then finally, sitting to her left is Garry Owens, who came of age in the 1960s civil rights struggles, joined the Black Panther Party in 1968, and has also been a representative of LELO for many years and engaged in many struggles. I'm going to add your biography, and thank you for stepping up to our website. What's that? I will thank Cindy as well. I'll just say a brief introduction on myself. My name is Ben Manski. I hail from Wisconsin originally. I am also a people's lawyer. I'm also a sociologist. I'm pursuing a PhD at Santa Barbara right now, sociology. And I have made it my life's work to build the democracy movement in this country. So I've been at that for 25 years plus. Just that particular cause was involved with co-founding Move to Amend and Liberty Tree Foundation, and many other things. The Wisconsin Uprising, I think, is probably the way in which I come in to the discussion here today to talk about how that's related to what happened here in Seattle. So that's the introduction. I think I've given you a sense of the discussion already, so I'm going to turn it back to Rose Brewer to lay out and frame the conversation a little bit further, and then we're going to get into our discussion. Sound good? All right. Thanks, everybody.
Now, you know this has to be shaken up a little bit. It can't be seamless, and it can't be simply the frame that is formally presented. And I'm going to do a little bit of shaking up around the framing. You know, I want to shift the periodization slightly. By 1992, an organization that I was fortunate enough to get pulled into and work for many years as a member as well as a board member, Project South, was just getting off the ground in 1992, had 6 years earlier been a part of the struggle against the Alabama vote fraud, and by 92, 500-year celebration of the African was on the agenda, and we formalized the board at that time. And I will, assert that this Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide was prescient in terms of understanding that there is a global South as well as an internal South that has played a tremendous role in understanding this country, its imperialism, its white supremacy, so many aspects of its history. And we're not going to understand very much about this country if we don't understand the South. Of course, I didn't know all of that before getting pulled in, but I had very good teachers. And it strikes me that we want to shift the periodization a little bit before 1999. A couple other observations about that. And again, because of the work we were doing in Project South, we were very aware of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the fact that Zapatista stood up and said that neoliberal globalization was going to destroy their way of life. So they were really the signal, the canaries in the mine shaft that told us that something very profound and dangerous was happening globally. And of course, that was a catalyst for what would ultimately become the battle in Seattle in 1999. I want to say just one or two other things before turning over to our panelists about the framing. I've been involved in the Black liberation movement for quite a while, and knowing what I know about Seattle, I do know that it was not a black space. It wasn't a people of color space. In fact, about 5% of the participants were either black, brown, And one of our leading comrades, Miss Betita Martinez, wrote an incredible piece on where was the color in Seattle. You know, as we're mulling over what we're going to do from that history to the current moment, we've got to ask hard questions about how we build movement in this country. Who's in it, who's not, and what does that mean for our potentiality for success? And surely we have to be clear that there were a lot of mistakes made. It was a tremendous defining moment in this country, but it wasn't all that it could be. And we're certainly in the site and the space where it happened. But I don't want us to forget how that crafting happened. And as we're thinking about where we need to go from here, how that has to be a part of the conversation. I know that in the wake of that reality, and in the wake of what we thought needed to happen by 1998, and I know my brother here was a part of that initiative, we were trying to build the Black Radical Congress in this country. So there is an entangled history that gets erased or invisibilized that I want us to give some thought to. Now, I didn't write the description, and I didn't participate in the conversations on the telephone, but I did want to take this moment to lift up those histories and to say that as we're thinking through this, to keep those uppermost in our mind. So I'm going to stop there and pose the first questions to our panelists. We decided to combine question number 1 and number 2 for panel number 1. And here the panel really is focusing in on the legacies of the 1990s and Seattle 1999. How did we get here, making sense of the current period, given that earlier history and the complications that I tried to infuse within that history. But the questions go this way, and our first 4 panelists will address them, giving us a sense of their personal involvement in the movements of that period in the 1990s, and a little bit about what their social change work was about, but also connecting it to the broader movements that were unfolding, and how, given 2020 hindsight, given your personal experience and given your connection to the broader movement, what were the lessons learned? How do you think that those movements are connected to the popular movements of today? So we can open it up with whomever wants to give it a go.
We're talking about 3 to 5 minutes apiece for these.
David, you want to kick us off?
I always do what Rose Brewer tells me to do. So in 3 to 5 minutes, I'm going to start by saying I am a revolutionary. I wasn't in November of 1999 because I didn't actually understand what that meant. I was a good person trying to do good things, but I didn't have sufficient context to really understand the structures and how the social, political, and economic institutions were operating. So I will actually start by acknowledging my own process stepping into November of 1999, and I was getting tear gassed and everything else, and I was like, I didn't realize it yet, but I wasn't actually that conscious. I was acting in a way that was trying to advance good things, but I actually didn't really have a full understanding. And I look back to and think about some of the language that I used, and I cringe thinking about how I talk about it, or how I talked back then. And so I say that to ask myself to give myself a little permission for not knowing what I don't know, and to invite you to think that same way too. None of us know what we don't know. Here's the other thing though. I think it's really important for myself and all of us, if we're having this conversation, to think about what Rose did in that earlier context. The global justice movement did not kick off or start in November of 1999. Those of us in this country tend to talk about it and think about it that way, and that is a place of profound ignorance. The reality is, part of the reason the Global South is so far ahead of us is because they don't have any illusion about how capitalism or empire or white supremacy actually operates. So in a very, like again, in 3 to 5 minutes, I think it's important to recognize that if we are going to actually look back, we don't just look back to November of 1999, we actually look back at the long historic context of where we are at this particular moment, where we were then. So there's more to say, but I'm trying to honor the time commitment.
So, I feel like, so I looked it up. I am a Gen Xer. I didn't even know that. And I feel like it's happening a lot these days that when I come to events, the room has a history for me. So I'm starting to feel like I've been around a little while, which for a long time I was the new one. But so this room, to me, especially resonates for I think it was the 8th anniversary of the WTO protest that I realized it when I sat down and Garry was sitting there, and that's exactly where he was sitting when we did our 8th anniversary, always to the left, commemoration of the WTO protests. And the reason we did it on the 8th anniversary is because the Battle of Seattle, the film had just come out from the Hollywood. Have you seen it? Lots of problems, even though, it was overall sympathetic. But anyway, so we're doing a lot of work to tell our own story of the Battle of Seattle. And so I appreciate opportunities like this to reflect on what those protests were about. And, obviously we need to be thinking about the legacy. So in the 90s, I graduated from the Evergreen State College in 92. And at the time, I just had been inspired to become an activist, but I did a little bit of college organizing, but not a ton. Grew up in a sympathetic or encouraging family, and I just want to acknowledge my awesome, almost 90-year-old father came, because he was a sociologist when I was born. He left sociology wanting and my whole life has been telling me it's so hard to change systems and that you should become a therapist like me because you can change people's lives more effectively on that one-on-one basis. But I was fortunate to come from a family where, because he carried me in a United Farm Workers strike on his back, my first word was actually strike, which is pretty wild. But so I wanted to become an activist, and the major issue that I'd been educated about by my professors at Evergreen, which is a great institution for training people to become activists or encouraging people, was NAFTA. And so I got involved in the NAFTA GATT Justice Committee, and that was just great training and grassroots organizing. And then I was really lucky to get involved in CISPAS, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. So I was trained to be an organizer by CISPAS. I'm still involved in the Central American and Latin American solidarity movements. Cindy and I have done a little bit of work together on Venezuela solidarity and other issues. And then that led me I was actually working for CISPAS during the WTO protests, so it was a great opportunity and I had just sort of by chance moved back to Seattle in the beginning of '99, and just, what an amazing experience for a young organizer to get to participate in the many, many different kinds of organizing that took place to pull off those protests. And I appreciate I always try to start, when I talk about the WTO protests, to acknowledge, the many years of organizing that were leading up to that, or, decades and many movements leading up to that. But it was pretty life-changing, especially being from Seattle. I mean, it had a huge impact on me personally, both as an organizer and as a human being. Just that week made me feel so vulnerable and sensitive and hyper aware of every possible level of what people were feeling and experiencing around me. It opened me up as a person, which is something I try to share when I talk about it too. So then I helped form the Community Alliance for Global Justice, and for me, I'm living the legacy in that, I'm from an organization that I co-founded, that came out of the WTO protests, and I take it very seriously that we're the institution in Seattle that gets sort of, you look up what institutions are related to the WTO protests, and we're one of the ones that always comes up, and as a result, get invited to speak about the protests. So I take that really seriously. We organize a huge People Summit for the 10th anniversary. We'll do it again for the 20th probably. I think it's really important for people here to be educated about what that was all about, and especially for young people to hear that it wasn't just about stupid people who are hypocrites in Nikes, hitting down the Nike sign at the store. Like, got my master's in geography, and when I was a teaching assistant, that was the dominant image for my students, was that hypocrisy that they thought they saw in students. So I think there's a lot of work to be done always in educating about why we were here and what it was about and how it was creative and powerful and strategic and successful. It was a really powerful set of strategies that came together and tactics that make that very historic and important event. The other way I feel like I'm living the legacy is that our organizing is under the umbrella now of food sovereignty. And I feel like the food sovereignty movement, which comes out of La Via Campesina, originated in Latin America and South America, and is now an international movement of peasants, small-scale farmers and farm workers, has really picked up the global justice work. I mean, it's the international movement that's, I think, most focused on moving forward the resistance to the international finance and trade regime, but it's also always building something very concrete. And I think for me, it's been a wonderful transition away from a focus on trade justice to food justice, just because it's so much more relevant. People understand why it's so important to their day-to-day lives. We all have an experience related to how messed up the food system is globally. And for me, it's just, going from just pressuring the elected reps who sell us out almost every time. I mean, hopefully they won't on the TPP, but wouldn't be surprised if they did. Changing where there's this multiple avenues of action that just feel a lot more proactive, and that we're building something while we're resisting, is really, I think most movements are always doing that, but food sovereignty just provides this vision that's something that we are inspired to work towards, and then it integrates so many of the movements, like the farm worker organizing happening in Northwest, like the grocery workers, fighting for so many different rights for all workers in the Northwest and throughout the country, like the International Resistance to Trade Agreement. So for me, the food sovereignty movement is one of the most powerful things that didn't just come out of WTO protests, but that was a really important part of the movements taking place then as well.
So when you sit next to your wife, you have to go next. So my experience is not unique necessarily, but I just want to say that my experience is not unique necessarily, but it's mine. I was born to a 16-year-old black high school student who was born in Eastern Washington on October 31st, 1944. World War II was raging in Europe in the Pacific Theater. 85 days before my first birthday, the U.S. military dropped 2 bombs on the citizens of Japan. The irony was that I was born in Chinatown, Seattle, at home, because at that time, blacks were not allowed to be born in the hospital, only to get our birth certificate. We could stay there for about an hour or so. I became an Owens when my mother married a war veteran when I was about 1.5 years old. Times got better. We moved to the projects in South Seattle. I had my own room, a dog, and a bike. Life was great. I didn't know that the real gift my mother gave to me beside birth was she taught me how to read before I attended school. I'll say it again. She taught me how to read before I started school. That was the greatest gift I think a mother or a parent could give to a child, especially in a society like this. In my 7 decades in this forum, I have learned people who look like me anywhere catch hell and high water every day. You are subject to be extremely poor, limited access to clean water or dignified sanitation, living in a war zone, illiterate, no government assistance, and usually a short lifespan. For a vast majority of black people and other people of color and some white people, this reality still remains. This provoked me as I got older to say, well, what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do besides read? And I didn't know what to do. So there was a group called the Congress of Racial Equality in Seattle, and they were marching downtown to protest the fact that there weren't any black folks working in the department stores, not even as janitors. So we marched down there every week, and that's where I got baptized. As I continued to read, I found out things that were shocking to me. One was that there was something called Negro History Week, started by a man named Carter G. Woodson back in 1926, to uplift the positive things that black people did back in those days. But at the same time, as I began to read, I found out that during the 1920s, when Black History Month started, 4 million white people joined the Ku Klux Klan. 4 million, not 4,000, not 400,000, 4 million. And so today I say that maybe that's why I'm still here, so not because of the Klan, but because I know how they started and why they started, and I'm here to know that, you all to know that I'll be here to the last bullet is fired. Thank you.
So I have to say that the WTO here in Seattle was a wonderful way to end that decade. Because for myself, the 1990s was a very difficult period of time for me as someone who began their political career in revolutionary organizations back in the 1970s. There's a book called Revolution in the Air, and during that period of time when many of us became politically active in the late 60s and 70s, revolution was in the air, and I feel very fortunate to have become politically aware during the national liberation struggles of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which continued to serve as inspiration throughout and continue to serve as an inspiration to me today. But through involvement in revolutionary organizations like the Union of Democratic Filipinos, Line of March, I learned that it was important to organize ourselves in organizations. That while individuals can accomplish a lot, you need organization to really begin to make the changes in society that you want to see. The other thing that I learned through that period was the importance of theory and practice, the need to study, and as well as that there's a relationship between domestic policy and international policy. They are completely linked together. And so through the 70s and 80s, those organizations provided the stability, the inspiration, the training, the theoretical basis for my work, as well as the work of many people involved in the Philippine movement and involved in a lot of the work that I did in the Asian community and broader human rights community. Unfortunately, during, at the collapse of many of the revolutionary movements throughout the world, our work with the Philippine movement our relationship was broken over different ideological differences and differences in terms of strategy of revolution, movement towards democracy and freedom in the Philippines. Our organizations dismantled. And that was towards the end of the 1980s and moving into the 1990s, which was 80s were difficult in the United States because of the Reagan administration and the attack, especially the support of dictatorships abroad. But the 1990s were also difficult because of the Clinton administration and this whole facade of the Clinton administration, dismantling of welfare, and everybody thought the Clinton administration was a great administration that you were working with. And there were no revolutionary movements in this country who were organized enough to challenge the illusion of moving towards a true democracy in this country. So it was really, for many years, for a few years, other than my involvement in LELO, which also remained a kind of a safe space for some of us who had revolutionary backgrounds, who understood the 3 points that I was talking about. But it was really for me in 1995, going to the United Nations International Conference on Women in Beijing, China, that re-inspired me, that showed me, I think, even more, the WTO inspired me, but being with 30 to 40,000 women who would not be beaten down, who came up with their own agenda, who networked together, made friendships that have lasted to this day, that inspired me even more so than any other movement that I have been a part of. The other movement that I have been a part of since the 1990s has been the movement to build solidarity with Cuba. And for me, this is what the WTO, Cuba, Latin America, so it's not enough just to be anti-neoliberal, anti-imperialist, but to begin to create the vision of what we want this world to look like. To look at strategies, and that's what the social forums were about, that's what the WTO was, and many movements that have been inspired post-1999. And I think that while there are elements missing in terms of, for us that were so organized, the kind of sometimes the lack of what we always call, 10-point programs, being democratic centralism, the movements that have inspired other people, like the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter movement, have served as an inspiration for me. But I really, for myself, it had been those two movements that have continued to inspire me, and I look at the countries especially that have begun to build alternative societies, alternative to capitalism and imperialism.
Excellent. So I had a chance to sit back there and realize I had not done something which was explained to you, the format of the evening. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so I decided to hide that earlier, not complain about it, but now I'll own it. So I'm just going to tell you that, first of all, you're going to hear a little bit from me, and you're going to hear a little bit from Rose in response to this question as well. There are reasons why, I actually organized this group of people specifically, and there are things I want you to hear from her. And frankly, as a Wisconsinite, there's some things I have to offer which I think would be helpful too. So that's how we're going to do this. There are a series of questions we have prepared, and I also did not inform you all how much time you had, so thanks for rolling with it. Everybody here has been around the block. I want to thank somebody who's not here today, Joe Swaya, who did the legwork on the ground in getting us the space here, introducing me to some of our panelists, and who was my city councilman when I was growing up in Madison, Wisconsin. I'll have you know, so my city councilman was a Green back in the 1980s. this is what I have to offer. I was politically active in the 1980s, but not particularly radical. I had my reasons. I was an immigrant. I was in English as a second language. I had a family history of struggle that informed me. My grandmother and my grandfather on two different sides were activists. I had my reasons, but it was really the end of the Cold War that was the period of my radicalization. I had friends who fought in Desert Storm and Persian Gulf War. I learned some things at that point that really radicalized me and opened my eyes. And I went through a process that a lot of people of my generation went through throughout the 1990s of discovering what capitalism really was. Right? And you know, some of the people who taught have already been referenced. I mean, I was a college student in Portland, Oregon when the Zapatista sent a delegation 2 weeks after the declaration of the Condon Jungle up the West Coast. Maybe some, I know they came to Seattle too, maybe some of you were there. It was inspirational in ways that I don't think can be really they have not fully been appreciated in terms of what it did to movements in North America and around the world. I was engaged in struggles against corporatization and austerity throughout the 1990s. The industrial Midwest was hit hard. We had the labor war zone of central Illinois, strikes across the industrial Midwest. We're still reeling from what happened to working people in the 1980s and 1990s. The corporatization of higher education was unleashed under the Clinton administration. The attack on welfare, which was pioneered in Wisconsin, funded by the Bradley Foundation, this racist corporate nearly $1 billion foundation that engineered the attack, the racialized attack on public education, on welfare, the privatization of the prison system. That was all tested out on people in my home state in Wisconsin. If you understand what's happening in Milwaukee right now, just know that it is in part the result of a political agenda, a deliberate agenda that people are responding to. I've been fighting in Milwaukee and in my hometown of Madison and many other places. So when I arrived in Seattle with over 500 other Wisconsinites that we knew about, right? We were keeping track of our people. The takeaway for me from Seattle was this is what victory feels like. That was the meaning of Seattle to me. It wasn't that we hadn't been in struggle for many years in all kinds of ways before, but it really then gave me a sense of the possibility that we might eventually win, right? And that we were actually correct about in our analysis of what we were up against, right? That it wasn't simply about trade, it was about global corporations, it was about corporate capitalism, it was us versus them, and it was a global struggle, and that we're gonna have to keep on fighting it for the rest of our lives. So there's a lot of other things that happened between Seattle and Wisconsin in 2011, and also the launch of Move to Amend in 2010 in response to Citizens United. But I just want you to know that when first 1,000, and then the next day 10,000, first 1,000 February 14th, 2011, then 10,000 the next day, then 30,000 the next day on February 16th, occupied the state capitol building in Madison, and soon we were 50,000 day after day, and it does get darn cold in Madison. When that happened, that was not spontaneous, that didn't come from nowhere. It came from all the work that had been going on in Wisconsin all those years that was directly tied to what happened here in the streets of Seattle, to what happened in Chiapas, Mexico. This is a continuous struggle. So for me, the lesson that I want to take from this entire period, and that actually I take from Wisconsin in particular, is that we will not win in the long haul if we simply rise up in unprecedented numbers as we did in Seattle, but also in Wisconsin, 150,000 people in the street, a general strike in education and the health sector for a week, 1 million people signing petitions to recall the governor, thousands of people out in the streets of small communities, rural communities all over the state. This was not just a Madison thing, unless we're prepared to fight to the end. And the problem with Wisconsin was it was not a revolutionary movement. It was an anti-austerity uprising, and somehow we have to figure out how to move to that next step to actually win power. So that's my lesson. I hope I kept the time.
You know, when I think about my history, I really think about something that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture said, and I mulled over it over and over again. He's no longer with us, but I don't know if we fully appreciate the contributions that he made analytically in terms of putting his body on the line. And once upon a time, he said he wasn't going to go to jail anymore. But he said he was born in jail. And I think if you are a black person in this country, you understand being born in jail. I was certainly born in jail in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where in 1921, the first acts of terrorism, U.S. domestic terrorism, destroyed the community that I grew up in and killed at least 300 people. You don't hear that story in the history. And obviously, that long durée of inequality can't help but shape you. I was coming of age by the late 60s into the 70s when we got involved in the Black Studies movement, demanding that the curriculum be decolonized, that faculty be hired of color, that these campuses be something that are meaningful to a whole range of students. It's really interesting to me, and I see one of my students in the audience, that these same demands are now being made on campuses as students struggle for some of the same issues. It makes us wonder how far we've come, and especially as students face in these corporatized universities exorbitant debt, their images and their culture not reflected there. So in some ways it seems we've come full circle with that set of challenges. I do honor that Black Studies struggle because I do know from the work that I've done with some of the young people involved in Black Lives Matter that that has been meaningful in their ideological development, for them to be able to read Assata Shakur in the context of some of the courses they were taking, for them to understand the struggle of the Black Panther Party and some of the contradictions of that. Without the struggles that we engaged in, the terrain for the current movement, I believe, wouldn't have been set. We didn't achieve the revolution that we wanted, but the terrain was re-articulated in a way that we can try again, we can move again, we can struggle again. So that's a piece of my history that I hold very dear and honor the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Ella Bakers and the Stokely Carmichaels, Kwame Toure's, and all those unnamed heroes and sheroes whose contributions we will never really fully appreciate. I also know as an academic, as a sociologist, as an activist sociologist, that the campus is not out there and the struggle is not simply external, but it's internal. I know we're going to have a conversation about what's going on in the context of scholar activism, but I do know that we need to really problematize this notion of help. What we're talking about, from my perspective, is how do we engage in joint struggle? I mean, you can't sit on the sidelines because we're all pulled in to this, especially at this moment in time. There is no outside. You know, there is an inside and an outside, and we have to be at the center of that in one way, shape, or form. You know, I've been coming to these meetings for a very long time, and me and my comrades, Walden and Jerome, always talk about they don't seem to get the message about what's really at stake, even as we're talking about social movements. But we're in a context of corporatized university education that has to be challenged as much as the structures of capital outside of the university. Those are capitalist institutions. There's no if, buts, and ands about it. There is no being outside of it if you are a professor. There is no being outside if you are committed to the kind of knowledge and the kind of collective, shared world that we want, where the people in the planet are at the center of our commitments. So we have a long way to go, and we need to think about how we're going to get there. Movement building is not simple, and you know, I appreciate Seattle, but when you don't have the fulsome complexity of genders, classes, races in a space, you can't build that movement in this country, and you can't build it globally. You have to have all those folk in some kind of, we've got to figure that out. We know in many ways that the system, what it represents, what it's been about. I just came from the World Social Forum in Montreal, and even though the particulars are different, the system is the same. So my history has certainly, launched me over periods of decades into the current moment, and I am just very hopeful that as another generation finds its mission and hopefully doesn't betray it, but carries it out, that we are moving in a way that we're going to have the kind of world that we want through the consciousness, vision, and strategy that it takes to create that. Thank you.
So it's probably evident the purpose of those questions is to give you a sense of who is up here and where they're coming from as we address the next question. And we have one further question to sort of lay the groundwork for the scholar-activist conversation. So I'm going to pose that. Yes?
Are we having small groups?
We are going to have small groups. Yeah, and to let folks know. Yes, thank you. And then we will go into small groups to have discussions. So we basically have like 4 questions, basically, we're posing. That's why I'm trying to keep people to time so that we can all get through this effectively, and then we'll go into small groups for conversation. So this is the last sort of question that I'm going to pose, looking back to look forward. And actually, at this point, I want to look forward. I want to ask each of you, what for you defines the period of struggle and political contention in which we live today? How do you understand it? And how do you think that today's moment is the same, similar, and or different from what it was like in the 1990s when you were engaged in struggle back then? So who'd like to start? Would we go in the same order or a different order? Who'd like to start? All right, very good. So we'll go with Garry Owens.
First, I need to acknowledge 2 of my mentors in the room, and I'd like to understand. You know who you are. Stand up. Stand up. Right there. And you too. No, man, you, brother. Jerome, Scott, and Waldo. Right. So, and the reason I wanted them to stand is because in my political development and working with LELO, we were fortunate to be surrounded by people who had a global vision about the commitment we were trying to get from our solidarity workers wherever they were. We said we had a common enemy, and the common enemy was what we see still now: greed, avarice, all this hostility towards average people, pimping people, holding people hostage for the rest of their lives, not letting their children grow into decent human beings, all of that. So we understood that it wasn't, so the connection to the question to me is, you have to have a global vision to even understand what's going on across the street. If you don't know what's going on across the street, if you don't know what's going on in other parts of the world, across the street doesn't make very much sense. You do victim blaming or whatever. They're just lazy. They're just this way. They're just that way. And that's not true. The notion that somehow we have solidarity with workers wherever they are is a profound concept. And we need to make sure that our movements project themselves not to stay in the silo that they projected to be in. So that I would like to think that Black Lives Matter is my ally, but it's not just about black people. It's about all of us in that sense. We all have a common enemy. Now, the way the enemy impacts us may be different. I understand that. But we can't stay in our silos and think we're going to be victorious. We have to have solidarity wherever it can be manifested. It has to be concrete. It has to have leadership. It has to have depth. It has to have some longevity. It has to be able to recognize when it's making a mistake and try to overcome that mistake. It has to have diverse leadership, not just men. It has to have diverse leadership. I'll say it again, not just men. So, can I hear some applause for that? And lastly, I think we have to have an agenda that is profoundly, not difficult, but it's not just words on a piece of paper. It's things that you have to strive for. It's things that you have to make mistakes because you tried so hard and maybe you didn't get there. But this is what the document says. This is what we ratified. This is what we said we were going to do. So if you're going to have a covenant with the people, you got to have something that makes sense. You got to have something that takes risks. You got to have something that has friends. You got to have some identity about who are your enemies. It ain't the guy across the street just because he disagreed with you. You know, it's much more profound than that. So I would hope that in our building a movement, that we recognize that it has to be very broad, very deep, and very widespread, and very connected. We probably, and I'll say this lastly, we have more reason to be connected now than ever because of them little things that we carry and all the different applications that people have to stay connected about some stuff that doesn't really matter. We need to be more connected, and so we live in a no excuse zone. So to make sure that we know what to do, when to do it, and who with to do it with, we need to connect that so that our movement has some recognition, not just in the newspaper, but within our own communities. Thank you.
So I think partly because of the WTO protests and, you know, largely because of, I think I became most aware of a shift thanks to the Occupy movement. I think there's just a currency, there's an understanding that capitalism is the source of much of what we need to fight against, all of it. That just wasn't, in the 90s, I don't think it just was something that the media, you know, even the mainstream media would be talking about capitalism as a problem, the way that you hear today. So I think, and then the other thing I think because of Black Lives Matter is that white supremacy is and sort of the other sort of biggest revolution that we need to have in terms of moving forward as social movements, I think, is just being talked about as current as something that, you know, I don't think college students who want to be activists there can't be one in this country that's not aware of what white supremacy means or is trying to understand what it means and understands how critical it is to engage in anti-racist organizing. So I think those two things are huge. I also think media is just obvious, you know, it's just obvious what huge role social media is playing in movements now. Just the ability, I mean, it's, you know, it's good and bad, it's complicated, it's overwhelming, but, you know, we have access to it and we can tell our stories so much more powerfully now. I mean, I've been telling the story for a couple years now of how incredible it is for me that the actions that my organization organizes have been covered by media because we're targeting the Gates Foundation and Costco, and I think because of that, like we're getting mainstream media, but I mean in 20 years of organizing, like so rarely, you know, has the media ever covered anything, right? But we cover it ourselves and we get the word out to our supporters, and I think that's huge, and you know, Twitter and everything has just played a huge role in global movements. And then I think the other thing that's, you know, that we weren't as aware of 20 years ago was just the climate crisis, and that I think defines everything that we're doing. It's both, you know, overwhelming and hugely challenging to take on, but I think it's also an amazing moment of opportunity, of intersectionality, of multiple movements coming together. And then, I mean, in Washington State, there's just been a really, it's been really great to see how the traditionally mainstream white environmental movement has been digging in and being challenged, and people of color-led movements and organizations and the state have been taking the lead on moving us forward in terms of the responses to the crisis. And I think that's that movement, that's sort of the super movement that, you know, we're all plugging into in some way, defines this moment, and I can't imagine it not defining, you know, the rest of time that we have.
So I'm going to do my best to take Ben's question head on. Was our struggle the same, and how are they different? how they're the same is that they were struggle for power, right? And I really want to be clear about that. And it's really, for me, very helpful to remember that as somebody who comes out of a European tradition, the language that I'm fluent in understanding is we talk about democracy. But what I've learned now that I've actually done a little study is, in the African tradition, they call it self-determination. In Latin America, they call it autonomy. But here's the thing, it's always about who gets to make the decisions about how our society is organizing. So we were in a struggle for power in the 1990s, but the difference is, and I think looking back on it, what we were in a struggle is to extract concessions out of the neoliberal capitalist economy. We were actually struggling to say we're going to make the ruling elite treat us a little more kindly or not as bad. We were actually trying to extract some concessions. And that's what I think, if I understand what my mentors have told me, and I will give Jerome and Walter the chance not to have to stand up again, but at least if I've understood what I've learned from them and Rose and other people, and looking at the historic context is, see, guys, we've never met, right? But I think you're right. Like, we have to unite and fight now because of this historic moment. There is something unique that has never happened before, which are a series of crises, an ecological crisis that Heather talked about. It's not coming, it's here and getting worse. And there is an economic crisis. It's not coming, it's here and getting worse. Let's be clear, capitalism cannot solve this economic crisis because capitalism is this economic crisis, right? I mean, like, we are living in late stage capitalism. And by the way, that leads us to the political crisis that we're in, because it's also important to recognize this. Capitalism is coming to an end. No doubt about it. But don't applaud yet, because my read is that in late stage capitalism, it becomes fascism. That's what's beginning to assert itself in this country. And you can't fight fascism with neoliberalism, because that's basically one side of the same coin. So these series of crises that are coming together, it is my assessment that we are in that historic moment where we are either going to win everything or nothing. That we literally are going to have to unite and fight. And you know what? I don't want to fight to save this dying, racist, sexist, class oppressive system. I want to fight to create a whole new system, one that is actually based on cooperation, love, compassion, a understanding of deconstructing of white supremacy and patriarchy and empire. So to me, like, I'm really working hard not to let my natural inclination for, like, getting big and let's go forward, but to answer the question that Ben has posed, if we are serious, we have to understand the moment that we're in. And it's not, we didn't create this moment. This is the moment that the natural context have happened. And I'm going to conclude with this. Mask no difficulties. Tell no lies. Claim no easy victories. We have got to put aside all of that. There are some great lessons to be learned that I experienced in Seattle, but there were some really profound difficulties that we had. And I thank you for bringing Batita's piece up. I thank you, because I was challenged by it. I remember being defensive about it the first time I read it. And thank goodness I had some mentors who helped me not get defensive and actually learn from it and think about it and understand intersectionality in a different way. So I thank Batita for making me uncomfortable and forcing me to look at some hard truths, and it's made me a better revolutionary.
We're going to, sorry.
That's right. I'm sitting here looking at my friend Senator Bob Hasagawa, who is a leader of the Teamsters and what was the Turtles and what was it? Yeah, right. During the WTO, and he's a senator now, and I think about the struggle he goes through every day as a state senator, and the difficulties he faces in terms of getting not just progressive legislation, but just legislation that will benefit working people. He's been working on a state bank. This is, and recently we became a state in which you can legally buy marijuana, and so he said, well, a state bank would help the marijuana industry because federal regulation doesn't allow us to use regular banks. But it's, in some ways, organizing today, I think, is much more difficult, even though we live in a world that technology has given us immediate information, enable us to build international ties, national ties with each other. Our movement is faced with a polarization of racism in this country. And even within our movement, the question of white supremacy in our movement, in our nation, has polarized in our legislatures, in our Congress, has polarized things so bad that now you have a Trump running for president of the United States and can say the craziest things he wants. And crazy not only in terms of attacks against Muslims, attacks against immigrants, and yet our movement, I don't think our movement, our left movement, is in a situation in which we can really challenge the type of fascist tendencies that are happening in this country right now. We have a lot of work, and we have lost. If we had been doing our work as leftists all these years, we would not be in this situation. I liken it to, I'm wearing this shirt today, never again, never forget, because we see the same situation happening in the Philippines. 40-some years later, after the Marcos dictatorship, people have forgotten what that dictatorship represented. We did not do the work in the Philippines as leftists. Our movement was split, and we lost much ground, in which you have a president, just like here, that has a lot of fascist tendencies. You have a president in the Philippines who says the solution to drug addicts is just kill them. And you've got impunity. Go ahead and kill them. And that's his war against drugs. I think the one issue that has become, for me, the issue that we must seriously grapple with in this country is the question of education. If only we had social justice education in this country, you wouldn't have people voting for Trump, saying that Trump represented their interests of the working class. Many of you are teachers here, you're professors, and you understand how transformative social justice education can be. That's why they have students sitting in front of computers without teachers going through, that's what's happened with corporate education. Bill Gates designing the big history project. Now, so what does Bill Gates know about our history? Nothing. And he doesn't want our children transformed into revolutionaries, into some people that can transform this world, that will benefit the needs of working people, not only in this country, but internationally. He doesn't want people, the corporate educators they want to make money off of our children. That's why we have the struggle of school to prison pipeline, because that's where our children are headed. That's where they have gone. And unless we change this education system, unless we turn it inside out, unless we provide our children with social justice education, we will not win power in this country, because our children will be doomed to go to prison, to be low-wage slave workers, and we will continue to be in the situation that this country is in now.
So the reason why I posed these questions, in addition to wanting to frame the conversation about scholarship and activism, study and struggle as the slogan of the Progressive Student Network was, in the 1980s and early 1990s, was because I am still reeling from what happened in Wisconsin over the last several years. I mean, the impact of, on the one hand, inspiring Occupy with thousands of people coming from around the United States and around the world to Wisconsin, and I can tell you about all the ties between Wisconsin Uprising and the Occupy movement if we wanted to have that conversation. That was great. But the cost of losing, functionally, has been enormous. The University of Wisconsin system tenure is gone. People are fleeing the state. Schools have been shut down across the state. Thousands of teacher layoffs, libraries closed, parks sold off. This is a state that has been in the heart of the labor movement, working people struggles for a long time, and it's really costing people personally in ways that are both economic and emotional. You know, I still can't even really talk about Wisconsin without sometimes breaking down into tears, right, over what has happened as a result. And so the question I ask myself is, how is it that we had this most incredible uprising in the history of the state, one of the largest uprisings in the history of the United States, very militant uprising, class uprising, and still lose, right? And the reason why I wanted to frame the questions the way I did was because I do believe that we are in many ways in the same period of struggle that began in the early 1990s, which for me really did begin with the declaration of war on NAFTA and the Mexican government with the Zapatistas, right? We are in the same period, and it's just more advanced. It's become more profound. It's more dangerous. I agree with the observations about some things that have changed. I thought those were really astute. They were right on. But I think that what has happened, as you have seen from the comments and heard from the comments of the panelists, is that the consequences of not winning have become more serious. And I want to figure out how to win, because I have personally seen the consequences of losing, right? So three conclusions I came away from. I actually just completed a study of the Wisconsin Uprising and the movement that sort of led into it. Why did we lose? One, there was a failure to escalate. Right. And the reason why there was a failure to escalate is that we believed, number one, that going in, that if we did the things that we actually did, we would win. Right? We thought it would be enough to occupy the Capitol building, to shut down institutions, to basically take over the state. In the past, that had been enough. It was no longer enough because we were against a very determined opponent, right? A movement from above, in the language of Marxist social movement theory today, right? That's number one. Number two, why was it that even though there was an independent left that was in the center that instigated the uprising, that planned it, right, that we were not able to force the escalation? I mean, after all, my labor council, I was a delegate to the South Central Federation of Labor. I was a member of the AFT. I've been in Wobbly since I was 15 years old. We called for a general strike. Why weren't we able to make that happen, right? Why weren't we able to escalate? We were too solidaristic. That sounds strange. We were too friendly to allies on the left. That's a conclusion I came away from. We could discuss it. But the left was not able to organize itself to counter the bosses in the Democratic Party, effectively. Number three, this goes to Rose's comments and others. We lost because we weren't solidaristic enough. Sorry for losing that. But there had been a whole history of multiracial organizing and struggle in Wisconsin, fighting the corporatization of welfare, the corporatization of prisons, and so on. But most of the unions in Wisconsin, most of the labor movement was not part of that. And if you want to look at specific questions in terms of pivotal moments in the history of what happened in Wisconsin, the failure for the labor movement in Wisconsin to mobilize the black community and black voters in the recall elections was due to the fact that the labor movement put up a candidate who had been trying to get rid of the elected school board in Milwaukee, who had been fighting the black community for years, time after time. They put up Tom Barrett twice, they put up a corporate executive a third time. So I think this question, it came back to cost the white working class in a big way in Wisconsin, that the labor movement overall had not been doing that work. So I'm going to turn it back to Rose, and then we're going to move on.
Well, we're going to move on because the time is moving, and Shar is. I'm just going to turn it over to you. So why don't you move us into the scholar activist piece? We'll go into whatever. Because the time is moving.
All of you have been sitting, listening. Many of you have already been at conferences all day. You've heard some very amazing people. I won't go into my history, although I'm happy to share later, because in fact, I could tap every single person here and show you a thread. And if I had time to talk to every single one of you, I think it would take 3 minutes for us to find a thread. Whether that thread is hearing someone, Malcolm X talking at the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Convention saying, Fannie Lou Hamer was my sister. I had to fight because they hurt my mother, they hurt my sister. And I'm a 14-year-old white kid in a dying mill town thinking, I'm not afraid of you. I understand fighting for your brother or your sister. So I could tap I was in CISPAS. Every single one of us could find a way that we connect through Central America or labor, where my dad started me out. So I won't go there right now. I think our mission for the next half hour is to figure out how we have these inspirational moments, but how do we move it somewhere? So I, as someone who loves teaching, but also wants to do movement-relevant research, and that's what I'm good at. I'm not good at a lot of things, but this is something I can do. It's a question of what can each of us in this room do uniquely well to learn to fight better all the kinds of problems that everyone has already described, right? And what we'd like to do is break you into groups of 5 or 6, and I brought 3x5 cards, and we want each of you, each group, to talk about what do you think are the burning questions where some more sort of research, if scholars do research, if that's what we know how to do, if it's our job, everybody has knowledge of the world. If it's our job to help people sort of distill their knowledge and give it names, or if it's our job to bring you the knowledge from other times or other struggles or other places, if that's what we can do uniquely well, if movements deserve researchers, what could we do uniquely well to advance movements? So we'd like you to break into groups, in groups of 5 or 6 around, just around where you're working. Each group gets 1 card, and you have to figure out what the burning questions are that movements you've been involved with need answers to. So maybe it'll be more than 1 question, but you've got a little tiny card. You're going to introduce yourselves to each other, and you're going to think about where would research matter. Okay? Does that make sense? And then you don't have to come back and report in groups because that gets too long, but we will read you each other's questions, and then we will provide the questions in some sort of format for anyone who's interested. Yes? Yes. Okay, so that's our plan. Well, the first news is that most of you flunked penmanship. But let me start with one that I can read. We asked all of you to do your most burning question and other questions if you had them. Most of you had multiple burning questions. So I'm just going to read through, and we're going to type them up, send out the list, and you can add or subtract. Lots of times when you come to an event like this, you meet really nice people, and then you start seeing each other, and that in and of itself is great. But to the extent that people have real conversations and real ideas, we wanted to give it some sort of life that could go on. And especially as I get older, like everyone in the room who's younger than me, I'm just leaning on you to keep pushing these questions and figuring out the answers. So I'm there as long as I can be there, but I need you. Ben, my friend Ben's in the room. Yeah, exactly, thank you. How do we dismantle whiteness? And how do we start to do that from within? Intra-institutional change, inside institutional change, do no harm to marginalized communities. What is the strategy now as capitalism ends? How do we help bring a transition that is a transition that's a livable transition for peoples? That was page 1. We need to study how system is changing and also to learn from the history of past struggles. Study up, not down, meaning take lessons and language from the movements that we care about. For example, in the homeless community which I work in Rhode Island. John Joyce, who is a white working class veteran who was homeless, said his key issue is State House, our house. And it's totally tied into the kind of agenda that David is talking about, because what John means by that is the State House should be the people's house, and the Constitution should be the people's protection. And in that one phrase, State House, our house, he said he wanted to take over government. And Reverend D.D. Williams, then, who is his friend, says, I know how. Reverend D.D. Williams says, you do community-based movement building. But she doesn't mean neighborhood organizing for streetlights. She means you do community-based movement building to get what John wants. So I think you can figure out that language is the same language people were using here today in terms of capitalism, but it's homegrown language that works in Rhode Island. So I think, yes, bottom up. I won't keep commenting. Who is left out of the narrative of social movements? John Joyce and D.D. Williams. Be in a discussion, because the tension is a good thing. Don't pull back and retire. All right. Let me pick one. You're getting picked in order that I can read the handwriting. All right. Why doesn't research go to alternative structure building for something new? How effective are reformist strategies? When do we, parentheses, radical organizers, come into power? What does equilibrium of crisis look like? Okay. Aren't these corporations, the corporations that do practice, aren't there corporations that do practice good economic social justice? Paul Newman. So do we have any models inside corporate structures that we would want to keep? When movements emerge and organize, there seems to be systems of micro inequalities. We reflect systems of macro inequalities. Why is that, and how could we avoid that? So all those cutting micro practices, death of a movement by 1,000 small insults and small aggressions, how do we deal with that? Are there communities that can be self-sustaining? In a revolution, we will need that sustenance in the communities. How do we ensure that? What elements go into that? Why is it that left movements have these problems of disorganization? Or hyper-organization too sometimes. Are there movements that have been successful and diverse? I like these questions. All right. How could life philosophy, a word I can't read, tell me later, such as secular humanism, contribute to social action? How to make people care? That's a pretty central question. How do we make broader groups of people care? Having a family is hard. Having a family makes it hard to make things better for others. So I think that's the whole tension between just hunkering down and taking care of your individual family, survival mode, and being still engaged. Community building, how to build and sustain solidarity. Human rights education, and there's something about social justice and human rights education, including social justice and human rights education. Okay. We need to study how systems are changing, learn from history of, that one I've already read. Read up, dot down. What is conscious, intentional reflection about the moment that we're in, and the sort of situations that are happening, to whom, by whom? What are movement actors thinking about? How could we create a conversational space, a convergence space for movement visioning and strategizing? How have coalitions been built in the past? How are coalitions being built now? What could coalitions look like in the future? What is labor going to look like? How can workers get leverage in the future? Okay, I think I've got them all. Yeah. Those are great questions. you can really see how those questions start to spell out an agenda, and we could look at this and hold it up against the agenda that Black Lives Matter, for example, has just published, and see where there's convergence and where the things could support each other. I'm going to pass it back to Ben.
So I'll just say this. Thank you to everybody who came tonight, not just the panelists, but especially everybody who took part in the discussion.